I don't know if you have worked with smart objects in the past or even if you know what a smart object is. In a nutshell, what a smart object is a file inside another file. Okay, so we can work with smart objects between Illustrator and Photoshop. We can work with smart objects between Photoshop and Dreamweaver, believe it or not. And what I want to show you in this exercise is how we can work with smart objects within Photoshop. So in other words, we can literally insert one Photoshop file into another Photoshop file. It's kind of crazy and bizarre, and it's really, really cool. And, you know, I got to ask, why would we want to do this? What purpose does this serve? These are some of the questions that I want to answer in this exercise, in this lesson. Just so you know, what I've done is I've taken this composition that we are slowly building up and I've saved them as statue.psd. You might want to take a moment and do the same. That's optional. You don't have to do that. And in order to make use of smart objects within Photoshop, I need to set up my screen in a very specific way. So give me just a moment here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and hide Photoshop, and I'm going to go all the way down to my desktop where I have my work files folder. Go ahead and look for your work files. Okay? And inside the work files folder, we have a file called text.psd. Don't double click on this guy. Don't open him up. All we want to do is simply highlight him at this point. Okay, so the first step in using smart objects inside Photoshop is to go and locate the Photoshop file that you want to use inside your existing Photoshop composition. Okay, now what we need to do is we actually need to set up ourselves like this. So in other words, we need to have Photoshop in the background with our folder, our files folder, on top of Photoshop, hovering on top of Photoshop. And what I'm going to do here, literally, is I'm going to take text.psd and drag and drop him into my Photoshop composition. And this is what I wind up with. It's kind of bizarre, isn't it, dragging a file into Photoshop? But this is what I wind up with. I see this large gray rectangle and some placeholder text in there as well. Now, this content, the gray background and the text, all resides inside text.psd. And all of this content, all of this material is enclosed inside this bounding box that looks very similar to the Photoshop Free Transform, if you'll recall. And by the way, he works in exactly the same manner as well. So we can rotate our smart object and we can scale them and all kinds of great stuff. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit Enter on my keyboard. Okay? Now, let me show you what's going on over inside the Layers panel. Take a look at your Layers panel. We now have a new layer called Text. Now, by the way, my text layer appears at the very top of my stack of layers because I happened to have white stripe, the white stripe layer, selected before I dragged text into the composition. So text simply gets created above the previously selected layers. So you may need to reorganize your layers panel depending on where your text layer wound up. Okay? Now, more importantly, take a look at the text layer thumbnail. This guy right over here, he's got a smart object icon in the bottom right corner of his thumbnail. So at a glance, we know that we have a smart object. Now, here's where things get really cool. What I'd like you to do is double click on that smart object icon, and we get this really kind of cryptic, weird message from Photoshop. Photoshop says, hey, after editing the contents, choose File Save to commit the changes. Those changes will be reflected upon returning to statue.psd. The file must be saved to the same location if the Save As dialog box comes up, and so on and so on. So I'm kind of sitting here going, all right, what are they talking about here? Well, I'm going to go ahead and click on OK, and check this out. Text.psd actually opens up inside Photoshop. As a matter of fact, it isn't text.psd. It's a temporary file based off of text.psd. And what we see here is the gray background with the placeholder text. And over inside the Layers panel, I can see the layers that have been set up inside text.psd. So in other words, what we can do now is we can go ahead and make some changes to this file, save the file, and have the smart object update back inside our statue composition. Let's give this a try here. So I'm going to go and change the Place Your Text that I have here, this placeholder text. So I'm going to tap the T key on my keyboard to activate my type tool, and I'm going to go ahead and select this text here. Now, this font, by the way, that I'm using is called Blackmore. Hopefully you have the same font on your system. If not, hopefully something similar came up for you. But not a huge deal if you don't have the same font. That's not really the intention of this exercise. So I've decided, by the way, that this composition that we're putting together, this statue composition, is going to be some kind of a community event. Maybe it's for a flyer or a postcard or something. It's going to be a medieval-themed dinner. So I'm simply going to type in here medieval and then dinner. There we go, medieval dinner. And I'll go back to my move tool. And, we might want to do some repositioning here, just dragging this guy over. I want the right sides of the text to line up there. You can certainly grab other layers and use your arrow keys on your keyboard to sort of position things up. That's perfectly fine if you want to go and change that date and so on. By the way, a quick aside, what we can do is we can select multiple layers. I just used the Command key or the Control key on my keyboard. And then what we could do is we could use the align options that we see up on the options bar, right? So I could line up all of the right edges, for instance. Just a neat thing that I just thought of here. Okay, so there we go. We've made our change to the text.psd file. The other thing I want to do is I want to disable the visibility of the background layer. That's this gray background that we see. So to do that, I'm simply going to click on the background layer eyeball to disable his visibility. He's turned off. He's still there. We can always pull him back, right? But he's just simply turned off like a light switch. So now what I see is this checkerboard pattern filling the background of my document, indicating transparency, of course. Go ahead and save your file, Control or Command S. Go ahead and close your file, Control or Command W on your keyboard. And notice, once we get back to our composition, that smart object has updated inside our file, which is fantastic. Now, it's kind of hard to see here. I'm just going to drag this down over top of the white stripe, something like that. There's the text changing there, of course, medieval dinner. There's the date, and there's the location, St. Peter's Hall, and everything's nice and lined up there. So this is sort of a simple example of how to work with smart objects inside Photoshop, as I'm positioning the smart object here, just using my arrow keys on the keyboard. Very simple example, but definitely very, very cool stuff. So we, again, literally have a Photoshop file inside another Photoshop file. And at any point in time, we can go and edit the original Photoshop file by double-clicking on that Smart Object icon inside the Layers panel.